Okay. So we all know what's going on, but this is for non-science careers in aerospace. I'm the director of Mom Loves You to the Moon and Back. It's just a small project. It's not like a company or anything. It's just something as a passion project that I do through my fellowship. I have with me, not with me, the moderator. With us today we have Audra Mitchell. She's the Assistant Director of Marketing and Communications at Astrobotic. And we also have Alison, the Director of Content Strategy at Govini. If you guys want to go ahead, maybe Audra, you can start. Tell us just a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, so I am the Assistant Director of Marketing and Communications at Astrobotic. I have been in that role for almost a year now. Previously to that, I worked in advertising here in Pittsburgh at multiple ad agencies for about 20 years. And then I sort of landed my dream job at Astrobotic. And I'm proud to say that I was part of the communications team for Peregrine Mission 1, which was very much the highlight of my career to date. So just excited to be here.
Thank you for being here. And Alison?
Yes, so Director of Content Strategy at Govini. It's a software company that takes a lot of data on mostly supply chain stuff and then helps to generate insights about kind of where all the supply chain pieces and parts are going. And at Govini, as content strategy, I run our editorial and kind of blog and digital media. I do media relations for our executive team and executive thought leadership, so their kind of conferences, talking points, and kind of speeches and stuff like that. I write and draft behind the scenes. And so previously, before Govini, spent most of my career in communications on the public sector with the United Nations in Senegal for a few years, and then almost 8 years in DC as well, kind of think tanks and the World Bank. And before moving over to the tech side about 5 years ago, first working for a consulting firm and then kind of going in-house for a client. So I've worked kind of in the space community. I had 2 or 3 space clients, so that was my first introduction, and I was just like very excited about all the, frankly, just like the industry that I didn't know existed, and how large it is and kind of growing. And so at Govini, we kind of work in that, but on the national security side, so we're working more like AppWorks and SpaceWorks and stuff like that. But, yeah.
That's so funny, it's that you say an industry I didn't know that existed, because I felt the same way about aerospace. I was in the astronomy program and then found the Z Factor Fellowship and was like, aerospace, that's not necessarily astrophysics, and this is a little more, what's the word, like able to get to,
Yeah. And I just hadn't thought of it as like such a growing $billion-dollar industry and like continuing to grow and stuff as our tech gets better. So it's neat to have a job that you didn't think existed like 5 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
That's something I feel like it's talked about too a lot in aerospace, is this idea that it's just growing so much and there's going to be so many jobs available.
Yeah.
As we're growing, at first it was all engineers, and as the companies grow, they're like, okay, wait, we need a lot more than engineers to actually make this work. So we're going to cover quite a few topics. I'm just going to kind of leave them up here. We'll just kind of move through them as they're listed. So, and they're not really specific to either of you, so whenever you are like, yes, I feel like I can answer that, we can just go ahead and answer it. So what do you feel motivated you to pursue a career in aerospace, especially having a non-science background? What led you in there?
Okay, I'll start. No, I feel like, and I don't want to talk forever, but I feel like everybody sort of has a space moment when they realize that there's a whole universe out there. And I very distinctly remember in kindergarten learning the names of the planets. And I think my mom tells the story because I came home with a little Jupiter that I colored in, and I thought I was telling her something she didn't know. I thought, this just in. There's more than the Earth. And from that moment on, I've always really enjoyed learning about space and have always thought that it was something just very interesting to me. However, when I grew up, there was not really a push for girls in STEM. And so I didn't see people like me in those kind of careers. Teachers weren't pushing girls to do STEM in the, early to basically the entire 90s. And so I just didn't know that was something I could do. And so when I've now been able to get an opportunity to do what I've spent 20 years doing, my profession, but also being able to do it in a place that really stirs my passions for space and really is exciting, I feel really, really fortunate to be in the position I am. But it wasn't something I thought, oh, I'm going into aerospace. It was not my intention. But now that I am, I'm just, gosh, am I thrilled.
I would say kind of similarly, my kind of like career North Star has been like making a positive social impact. Like I was in the humanitarian world for a while and the national security space, but like when I started working with space clients that like were very focused on using space to like also benefit Earth, like I was just like a very like light bulb moment. I thought that was so cool. I think it was like a low Earth orbit satellite company that was like creating internet in parts of the world that didn't have internet before. I was like, oh, this is like really awesome. And so when that kind of clicked for me, I was like, this is like a new industry where it's like kind of growing and evolving, and you kind of get to keep learning, and like new technologies keep popping out of almost nowhere, it seems like, but still kind of create that impact for like our communities here too. So it's kind of a good mix.
Yeah, the sustainability efforts of aerospace are definitely, I feel, in the public eye a lot right now. So it's nice to see that highlighted, that this is something that we are concerned with. We are thinking about it. We're not just willy-nilly kind of launching rockets and satellites into space.
Which are cool.
It's really cool. Do you feel there were like kind of like a pivotal moment for you then, Alison, where you were like, okay, aerospace is going to be it?
Yeah, I think it was kind of just really, I don't know if it was a single moment, but it was like kind of learning about the sector and kind of how, yeah, kind of like symbiotic it was a little bit with like kind of sustainability efforts and stuff here too.
And so then if we started off in different career paths. So how did you kind of navigate that transition between what you were doing and then coming into aerospace? Or do you kind of feel like, oh, this like, it just happened, it fell in my lap?
For me, I think I also similarly didn't have a STEM background, been more on the writing side of things and kind of communications and stuff. But I think for that's might be similar for a lot of people looking to get into the space field. Like, not everyone is going to be an astrophysicist or like a astronaut, and so there's definitely a lot of like different skill sets that I think can contribute. And so, having like a different technical skill, whether it's like communications or like product design or graphic design perhaps, or kind of like things like that too. Like all of those skill sets are needed, I think, for the space economy. So for me, it made sense. Like I could kind of say like, oh, I have this communication skill set that has worked in these sectors, and kind of I can help tell stories in the space sector too. So,
yeah, and I think similarly to Alison, I don't think that I could do my job as well as I do now if I didn't have the experience of communicating for a variety of clients, from retail to higher ed to industrial to all of those. I use all of those sort of tools in my toolbox. And part of that is because Astrobotic is really interested in sort of educating people about space, people of all ages, primarily children. And so I'm able to sort of use those communication strategies that I learned throughout my career as a way to teach people about, space careers and things like that. So I do think, just being experienced in your chosen field is a big help when you do find something in aerospace, because you're not also like learning how to do. So for me, marketing and communication, you're not learning to write, you're not learning how to communicate. You're just sort of taking the skills you already have and transitioning them into a science-based career.
I think that's a really great point. When I spent like 20 years in restaurants, managing, GMing, opening restaurants, and I was like kind of embarrassed by that when I started making the transition. But when I would talk to people in aerospace, everybody was like, this is actually a very great skill set for you to have, is like being able to read the room and knowing how to talk to people and, understanding like client needs, those kinds of things. So I think that that's something that's really great about the aerospace industry as well, is that people are very willing to recognize those transferable skills and be like, no, this is good. Like, this is totally fine. We need this. And so then if we're talking like transferable skills, what do you think are ones, I guess we kind of already like really touched on that, like the ones that have been really strong in carrying over. And then, if you have a non-science degree, but then you're surrounded by scientists. So how do you find that like the communication between that works?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for folks who don't necessarily have a science degree, I remember when I kind of first started working with like a more like technical crowd or like kind of space-based or stuff, they have a ton of knowledge that like I don't have, and probably, learning always, but I tried to kind of like remember that I have a different skill set and so have different insights about an area that they might not know also. And so like I think there's like a lot of value that comes from those two groups who have extremely different experiences and backgrounds talking to each other, and that like kind of creates that stronger team and work product and like value for the organization. And I think for kind of similarly I think there's also what you were saying, for people who are especially more junior in their careers and kind of just like looking for a first job, something that I wouldn't discount is also just like kind of core, like being responsible, like being dependable, like working well with your team, like that matters so much. And so I think like kind of the attitude also for folks who are more junior and are like, I don't know, I don't have 20 years of experience in this industry, I want to learn, that like wanting to learn matters a lot too.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I have to agree. In my experience with the folks at Astrobotic, one thing is that the engineering staff and the science-based staff have been really generous with their time when it comes to communicating things to me and answering my questions. Because at the end of the day, it's sort of my job to take these really, for the majority of the population, very hard concepts to understand and distill them down to about a 6th grade reading level, because that's kind of the national average. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of good that I don't know everything, because I can say, well, everybody doesn't know this, so we need to sort of talk around this in a way that is more relatable. Because when you're an engineer and day in and day out you're working on a lunar rover, you are in a little bit of an echo chamber and you think everybody knows all of these terms and things like that. So I think it's really good for somebody who has a little bit more of a civilian understanding of science and space to be able to say, okay, we need to work on this language to make sure that the people at large understand. So I do think, especially when it comes to communications, having a non-STEM background can be helpful, especially if you're trying to communicate to the general public.
So actually, a very pointed question for you then. When we're doing some science communications and we're talking to the engineers, can you give some examples or ways that you're able to like disseminate this information from them so that you can understand it yourself?
Honestly, Google is my best friend. Like sometimes the words come through a document where it's, here's a document about a contract that we just received. I need to write a press release about it. And some of the things there are words in there that I've never even seen in my life.
Acronyms.
Oh my God, the acronyms. We have a Confluence page that's just space and science acronyms because there's so many. And I spend a lot of time just Googling and sort of reading articles about certain things, understanding them and not understanding them as fully as an engineer or one of our scientists would, but sort of wrapping my head around it and then sort of going back to them and saying, my understanding is X, Y, and Z. Would that be correct? Now, sometimes engineers, and I don't want to generalize, want you to stick to that very strict science verbiage because that's how they understand it. But I've at Astrobotic, our mission statement is to make space accessible to the world. So I can go back to that and say, and if we're trying to make space accessible to the world, those terms aren't going to work for most people. So it's been like a really great open line of communication. Some people, you know, who don't want things to be distilled down, but it's sort of a back and forth. It's, you know, an open line of communication, I've found.
And I think something too is like, it's really totally what you said, and like I try to think of it as like a partnership, and I'm like, okay, like tell me if I'm keep me honest, like is this accurate and like correct, and like make sure, you know, if you have this rigorous background that I don't necessarily have, then like you can kind of make sure that I'm not going to put something out there that's wrong also. But there's kind of a back and forth of like, but at the same time, I think we can like turn this phrase into something that more people will understand too. It's kind of finding that balance.
Right, I totally agree. A good example, we the Moonshot Museum, which is attached to which is part of our building, looks into our large clean room, and they were doing something called RT testing, so radiographic testing, and you know there was some signage and things with, you know, telling people not to go into specific areas, and you know, from a public person, I looked at it and I was like, if I saw those signs, I would be scared. They looked like, you know. And so it was like, please explain to me what this testing is. And at the end of the day, it ended up being, we kind of trained the museum staff that, you know, instead of talking about radiation, all this stuff, say, just like an X-ray looks to see if you have broken bones, this type of testing uses X-rays and gamma rays to see if there's any cracks within the structure. So it was like, just sort of taking something that was really hard for people to understand, doing like a little of my own research, going back to the team and saying, if I'm saying this, is this correct? And then, you know, all these students came in and they weren't scared. They understood what was happening, or, you know, the signs didn't make their parents nervous anymore because they knew what was going on.
I think those are some really great points too. Which is so funny. In the end, when I was preparing all this, I was like, we are all science communicators by trade. Like, and I think so much of non-science in aerospace ends up being science communication. But it's a great point to make that, like, one, you end up really leaning on your communications, the things that you know work in communications when you go through this. You still end up doing some independent research, like know that that's going to happen for you, and then those things that happen in the classroom are still part of like your work life of like, you have to be able to speak up and say, hey, is this right? I love the phrase you used too, like, keep me honest. Is this, you know, is this going to be okay? Is this correct what we're saying? And the back and forth between, you know, that's still something that's experienced in the workplace.
I think that to get more people interested in STEM and space careers, part of that being able to communicate to people in a way that they understand, it takes away perceived barriers to entry. If everything you hear about space, aerospace, science careers is in words that you can't understand because you haven't had that type of education, you think that those careers and jobs and everything are out of reach for you. So I think a big way that aerospace companies can reach out to people in those non-STEM careers, because they need HR, IT, all of those things, is to make sure that their communications bring people in and not act as a barrier for people to enter that field.
That's such a great point, and a really great transition to my next question, which is like, what are some common misconceptions about working in the aerospace industry, especially for people with non-science backgrounds?
Yeah, I remember when I was at a space conference in DC, like everyone kind of it's a, you know, kind of tight-knit community. Everyone's really excited about space and stuff like that. But people would open like their speeches would be like, and everyone said space is hard. Like it's always, you know, it's so hard like up here. And I remember kind of hearing that and being like, it's incredibly complicated to like launch a rocket into the air or like a satellite, yes. But it's also like, that makes it feel so, like you were saying, kind of inaccessible. And so there's, I think, like for me coming from a communications background, it was like the kind of space community and things like that is for, you know, scientists, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it did kind of keep people out. And then the other thing I would say is a misconception is that I had was, I just thought of it almost as niche when it's really, I don't think niche anymore. Like there's so much technology going into space. A lot of companies use like satellite data or like whatnot and like embed that into their software. So it's really kind of spreading into more and more fields. So I think it's more linked with the rest of like the tech world than most assume too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, when I was beginning to, when I found out, I think when I found out I had the job at Astrobotic, there was this moment of fear that like, almost imposter syndrome, which, we could have a whole talk on that. But it was like, am I gonna have the right stuff to, I don't think compete is the right word, but to be thought of as a professional in this world where I don't necessarily come from. And I think what I realized was, if aerospace, if all they needed were engineers and physicists and technicians, they wouldn't have hired somebody to do marketing communications. So they need me. They need people with my skills. They need people with a whole host of skills. And so there was this part of me that had this little, like, almost lack of confidence that I could, live up to the brains in the room. And I think, I had to sort of say to myself that, my role, although I'm not, designing a spacecraft, my role is important too, and my skill set and my expertise, they wouldn't be able to do, Peregrine Mission 1 wouldn't have been able to happen without a communication strategy, all of those things. And so I think I just had to sort of like get over myself and not feel like that I'm not as important or something like that. And I think what really taught me that is when I started working there and people started treating me like I had the expertise that I do. I kind of thought, oh, everyone's going to think, oh, she's the communications gal. She's not going to, she doesn't know what she's talking. Everyone treated me that I was the expert in that field. And I think that any fear that I had went away.
I love to hear that, and I really want to, I know we're from Pittsburgh, so, but I gotta highlight the Astrobotic Peregrine 1 campaign, which was highlighted a ton in how honest it was, and just how see-through when it went up and it started losing fuel and it wasn't gonna complete the mission that we thought, but people really respected that communication strategy of just openness about what was going on with Peregrine. And there was a lot of articles written from some big names about, we'd like to see more of this.
Yeah, I think, going into mission, my director and myself spent a lot of time reviewing the strategies of other private space companies when things went right, when things didn't. And one of the things that we found was the majority of private space companies and even governmental agencies, when something goes wrong, went silent. Mm-hmm. And when iSpace in Japan had their first lander that failed to soft land successfully, they weren't quiet, and they got and it was a positive reaction from people. And I think we had always planned to be open and transparent. I mean, again, going back to our mission statement to make space accessible to the world. Part of what we do is making sure we're educating people and being open and transparent. But I will say in that moment, when you find out there's a critical anomaly, you do question yourself. But I think one of the positives at Astrobotic is we're like 85% employee owned. So it's not a billionaire's pet project. We're not beholden to shareholders. So, go quiet because you don't want the stocks to go down. So it really is an opportunity to, all the cards laid out in the right way to be able to be open and transparent. And that was hard. There was a lot of things happening very, very quickly. Everyone was working like 24 hours a day. And it was challenging, but when we started seeing people reaching out to not only like the leadership team, but us as communicators separately saying, more of this, like we need more of this, I think kind of kept us going because, we went from thinking, okay, we're going to do a launch, everything, if everything goes well, then, it will have a little bit of downtime and then but then it was 10 straight days of, just constant changes, constant things that were happening. And we just wanted to show people that, you know, we only learn how to do things through failure. You know,
Yes.
when you look at any of the, you know, if you look at the Apollo program, there were huge failures, loss of human life, things like that. And I think that we have to accept that when you're doing something really hard and really challenging that no one's ever done before, you have to factor in some failure. And instead of hiding from that, let's embrace it and show people that you can move on from that.
And learn from it.
Exactly.
So in that vein then, you know, I have a series through the nonprofit that I work for, Stemnetics, where I interview women and we talk about what it really took to get where you are. And a lot of people say, like, this isn't talked about enough. So if you don't mind sharing, like, you know, from undergrad to where you are now, like, what were some roadblocks that you encountered that almost stopped you, or, you know, were just really hard and that you had to overcome to make it to where you are now? That one's a curveball. We didn't prepare for this one.
So many. No, I can kind of start. I think for me, some of the roadblocks that I've kind of had to maneuver around, so my kind of background has been writing communications, and you know, I have really loved telling stories to kind of make that positive social impact. Has been kind of like my guiding thing. But I've always felt a little bit like sometimes communications can be a little siloed from the people doing the work almost. Sometimes it feels like, whether it's like the engineers building things, or when I was working on the more international development side, like the people in the field doing work, so I would kind of always try and get closer and closer to that action, basically. So that was something that I remember working in the US and feeling like, oh, I'm so blocked, like I don't really know what's happening. So when I graduated, I decided to do field work with the UN, and so I could kind of get that more experience. And I think that's kind of been a consistent theme, like working in communications, I just tried to get closer and closer, so I'm not like siloed, I guess. And then I think a second challenge that I've tried to figure out in my career is moving over from public policy to kind of the tech world too. And so when I made a transition from working at the World Bank in DC, and I was kind of more on the humanitarian side, I was trying to like embed policy research into government policy about what works best to empower women economically. But I was really interested in tech, and so like we had some tech projects at that World Bank team, which were really fantastic. And like talking about fintech, I was like, I know that I want to kind of break into this tech community. So I took more of like a little bit of like a leap of faith from like the bank, which had like a really large structure and like kind of more set career path, and went to a smaller consulting firm. And that was very scary, but it was also one of a really great professional experience for me, because I got to work on a smaller team and really work with directly more with tech and national security. So it was kind of, it was a great stepping stone, but it was a little bit scary to take the leap from something that was very established into a much smaller company that was a fantastic learning experience, but was, you know, new and was a little bit more risky, I guess, at the time.
Yeah.
I think for me, I think timing has been challenging in some ways. You know, I graduated with my undergrad in 2004 and entered the workforce, you know, shortly after that. And so within like 2 to 3 years of me entering the workforce, the Great Recession happened, and there were, you know, everywhere, and, you know, at that time I was in advertising, and there was, you know, layoffs happening everywhere. And so I think in some ways that instilled in me a fear of, you know, there are world forces out there that I can't control that can affect my ability to work and earn a living. And so I think it probably made me a little more I'm a little more willing to accept things that I would not accept in my career today. So you know, just things, you know, like being passed over for certain roles to go to generally men, things like that, that today I would raise my hand and say, whoa, 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 whoa. But I think for me, like the timing of when I started my career I mean, there was still, not that things are perfect now, but there was so much more very obvious sexism in the workplace, at least, you know, in the advertising community. I don't think anyone would be surprised if you've watched Mad Men, you know. But I think that in some ways I kind of put myself in a bit of a corner because I didn't want to cause trouble because I didn't want to be the person that got laid off the next 5 years when new layoffs happen. You know, I think that sort of made me a little risk averse, made me not initially like stand up for myself. So I think it took me a long time to be able to sort of have a voice and be able to you know, stand up and speak up for myself in the workplace. So I think that's probably the one thing that I felt, I don't know if held me back, but it's been something that I've been working to get past now that I've, you know, had years and know my worth as an employee in the workplace.
Thank you both for sharing that. Yeah. You know, I think there's so many roadblocks as you go through, and you know, when you're in school, you hit them while you're in undergrad in a way, right? And then you kind of think it's going to be a little bit of smooth sailing. And the one thing that we really try to highlight and talk about a lot is that you have to be willing to pivot. You can have this plan in your head, but things are going to change as you get out there. And not only just like from a outside perspective, but what you want will also change as you start doing things. And I've also gotten the advice from one of my other mentors at the Planetary Society, Ray Pilata, when she said, you know, I think everybody should work at a startup at one point because you just learn so much so quickly because everything's on fire the whole time. So, you know, don't be afraid of those opportunities too. If that's the first thing you get, like, just do it because you're going to learn a lot from that. And in that vein, what kind of advice would you have for undergrad students, you know, interested in pursuing aerospace but going through a non-science degree at this point?
I think my biggest piece of advice is something I wish, maybe just because I wish someone had told me, because I was very stressed about my first job out of undergrad. I was like, put a lot of pressure on. I was like, it's the first stepping stone to my whole career. Like, I'm not, you know, I just put a lot of self-pressure on it. And I think what I realized throughout kind of my career is, especially in the first like 5 years, that actually every job is really an opportunity to like figure out what path you want to be on. And then if you don't like, you can learn about what you like and what you don't like of a specific role. And then you can kind of figure out like, okay, for my next job, maybe I love doing social media. I hate doing like speech writing or something. You're like, okay, I'm going to like dig deeper into social media. So like every job is an actually opportunity to learn and figure out what you like and don't like. And it's there, and you can really, if you have translatable skills, you can kind of learn different sectors and things like that. You're not going to be in one the whole time. Like I went from humanitarian to national security to like space tech. Like it's all really more translatable and more fluid than they don't have to put so much pressure on yourself.
Yeah, really nonlinear.
I think one of the things, especially very early in my career, that now I really know how helpful it was, is finding someone to be a mentor. Mm-hmm. So I've had some mentors in my life who have really shaped, you know, my career and given and opened me up to opportunities that I probably wouldn't have had. So I think that, you know, finding somebody who sort of has what you want, you know, is if somebody has the job that you think that would be my dream job, I feel like reach out to them, see if they would meet you for coffee, see if you can do some sort of mentorship. The networking, I think, learning from people who have had the experience, have gone down the road, and even finding somebody who's willing to sort of take that mentorship role on with you, it can be life-changing. And you may learn from your mentor that, you know, even though you saw like, this is my dream, when you actually meet with them and learn more from them, you might say, okay, from on paper that looked like my dream, but now that I know more about it, my dream's something a little different. But I do think finding the people, you know, they always say if you can't see it, you can't be it. So if you see somebody who's doing what you want to do, trying to make that connection. Because I've found in not only just aerospace, but in many worlds, people are really open with their time if you show that interest. And people want to give back. They want the next generation of folks to come in with the skills that are needed. So I think finding, especially when you're younger and just starting out, and I think for students, that could be through professors, say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Is there somebody that, you know in the world that might be somebody that would help me and talk to me? So I think there's a lot of avenues that way.
I've been given that advice before as well, to collect as many mentors as you can along the way. And it's not always like a formal, will you mentor me, but just like you said, having coffee chats or having people kind of in your network that you're like, hey, do you mind talking about this real quick? Or, helping me out, throwing an event at the observatory all the time. And they're just like, yep, I'll do it. So that kind of stuff really helps out. I'm going to take a quick pause just because the lighting has changed so much. And I want to be sure that it's still showing up. So then we were just talking in the networking space as well. And networking in aerospace is really, really, really important. It maybe is in every industry, I don't know, but I know that in aerospace it really matters. So are there any strategies that you found that are like really effective going through networking with professionals from diverse backgrounds too? Because like we're saying, it's not always just engineers and things that you're speaking with.
Yeah, I think one thing in Pittsburgh that I think is really great is any industry or job or anything that you're interested in, there is a professional organization around that. So if you're interested in aerospace or tech, look at the Pittsburgh Tech Council. And for folks who are students or early in their career, there's usually young professionals organizations in those sort of networking and professional development groups. And I think that can be a really good way to sort of open doors and meet different people. It's sort of becoming a part of that. It doesn't have to cost a ton of money. A lot of them throw free events for students or deeply discounted for young professionals. And so I think that gives you an opportunity, again, to meet people who could be in your network, who could be those mentors, because that, if people are involved in that organization, they're sort of wanting to participate like that. So I would say, looking for organizations in your area that sort of fill or about the things you're interested in, and you'll meet like-minded people.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think there's almost like for most industries, like almost like a conference circuit of like, there's all these bunches of conferences that, some are free and then some are, paid to go as well, which can be challenging. But kind of like getting in the loop and like the habit of going to those. And then I sometimes, when I would go to a networking event, like I'm a little, shy and kind of generally introverted, so I would find it very challenging to like go in, and especially if I was by myself, kind of like walk up to someone and just start a conversation. I was like, do they want to talk to me? But so I don't know, these are like my very tactical tips for networking for introverts, but I used to like play a pump-up song and get excited because I was like about to talk about something that I really liked and like an industry that I was really interested in. And sometimes I would like even enlist like maybe someone who maybe didn't even work in that industry, but like was interested in kind of learning about it to kind of come with me as like a, wingman, exactly, wingman. And it was a lot easier that way to kind of spark a conversation. So that's like very, very tactical, nitty-gritty tips. But for me, when I was so nervous to start networking and building my community, that was kind of how I jumped into it a little.
That's a great point. I find that for some of those networking things, and most organizations that, or, you might know somebody, that stick with the sales guys. Or the salespeople. Go to the networking with them because they'll talk to anyone, and and then they'll sort of introduce you, and you're just like, oh, this is sort of easy. It's not up to you to walk because they will walk right up to somebody and oh, do you know my friend Alison? And then it's like, oh, good, I didn't have to like be the feel weird walking up to somebody. So finding your like extroverted friend or somebody who works in sales is a good way at these types of events.
What I found worked really well for me too was volunteering at them. You show up as a volunteer, especially do registration, because then you're like people see you all day and you learn everybody's name, and then like when you have a little break or you're able to go to one of the talks or anything, you just kind of slide in there and you're like, hey Clive, and they're like, hey girl. And I found that made it a lot easier too, and it kind of takes the pressure off of like I have to talk to everybody because it's like you're kind of supposed to do it anyway. So yeah, I think those are actually a bunch of really great tips to get in there.
It's also got like some eyes on, and I was like, oh, I remember that person looked like they were doing something really cool.
Yes.
Like, yeah, it's a good tip.
And you kind of you'll hear everybody talk about everybody too, so you kind of learn who the big players are at the conference like really quickly. You know what I mean? Because everybody's like, oh, I can't wait to like talk to this guy. And you're like, well, what does he do? What does that guy do? Yeah, volunteering. And then you don't have to pay for conference. So we'll kind of move into our last bit here, which is like personal growth and satisfaction. So, what aspects of your career in aerospace are bringing you the most fulfillment, particularly considering the non-science background aspect?
I think the biggest one for me is getting to keep learning something every day. And we talked about this a little bit, like when you're doing a lot of writing and communications and explaining things to people who maybe haven't heard of them before, you get to also learn about that subject. And so that's why like I've really loved working in communications. It's like you get to learn about something and then you have to learn it so well that you can explain it to someone else in a very basic way. And so I think working in kind of like the space and national security community keeps every day interesting in that way. So I think that's been something that's really fulfilling to me.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I always say it's so fun to go to work where everyone's smarter than me. Like it's just like, because I get to be a bit of a sponge and talk about things and learn about things that, I didn't know that I would get the opportunity to be so ingrained in. But I also think one of the things that I find, especially now that I've been working for a while and I'm kind of midway through my career, is that we have a lot of students and Girl Scout troops and STEM organizations for kids that come into the museum, and getting to volunteer to speak to those students is really, really great to see. When I first started working at Astrobotic, there was a girls STEM program that came in and I was going to speak to them, and at first they said, who's interested in going into a space career? And like one or two girls raised their hands, and then they did the whole program. I spoke, a few and then a female engineer spoke, all this stuff, and at the end they said, okay, no pressure, but who now is interested in going into space? And almost every hand went up. And so I think that space is one of those things that just like, it opens up everybody's imagination. And so being able to be a part of an organization and a part of an industry that just makes people really excited and makes especially students be able to think of themselves in a bigger way, and really get to have this like aha moment about space and about science and what's out there and what the possibilities are. I think from a personal fulfillment point of view, it's the most fulfilling job I've had to date, because I get to communicate really exciting, interesting things to people, and in the grand scheme of things, it's small, but it feels good to be able to communicate that to people.
So that's outreach and the constant learning, which is definitely something that you're going to find in aerospace. You just are. They're like kind of the cornerstones of whatever job you're going to end up in. Those are things that are going to happen for you, is constant learning and being able to get this outreach, because we, like you said earlier, we all want to see the next gen come in and be as prepared as they can be, and be welcomed with open arms. I think that's a big thing for us in aerospace. Well, I want to thank you both
For organizing.
This was,
yes, thank you.
This was fun.
Yeah.